Today is September 3, 2016, and it is a Sabbath, seventh-day Sabbath, and the new moon of the 6th month. Let us talk to our Heavenly Family. Eloheinu, Heavenly Family, Todah Lakal, Watodah La'emet. Thank you for everything, and thank you for truth. Help us in this meeting to understand the message that you have for us today. Help us not to get to the end of the meeting without really getting it. Guide everyone who should be on the meeting to be on, Heavenly Family. Orchestrate it according to your plan. And give us all the atmosphere of holy angels. Chase away any forces of darkness or any negative influence that could possibly influence any of us to have anything other than the utmost reception for your truth. So please guide us, Heavenly Family, and let it all be according to your will. Thank you so very much, Father, Mother. We ask these things, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So, today we are going to talk about a text known as the Apocryphon of James, otherwise known as the Secret Book of James. Some people even call it the Letter of James, but that's kind of confusing because the Book of James in the New Testament is often called the Letter of James. So, preferably the Apocryphon of James or the Secret Book of James. You know, an apocryphon is a writing which is considered apocryphal. Apocrypha just means hidden. So this is the hidden book or the secret book of James, so the Apocryphon of James. Before we get into reading it, I'm just going to tell you guys a few things about the Apocryphon of James, and I'm going to read a couple things to you concerning it. And this is kind of to explain why it's something worth looking at and something important to look at. So, first is I will mention that the Apocryphon of James was a text coming from the early centuries of the Common Era that was unknown to modern people until 1945 with the discovery of an ancient library that was buried in the ground in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. So Nag Hammadi, if you look up Nag Hammadi and the Nag Hammadi Library or anything like that, you'll come across this. It's a find of a whole bunch of ancient texts, many of which are Christian texts in some way, and I use the term Christian broadly, as in just related to Jesus, to Christ, and but it's not exclusively Christian texts, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But within this collection, it was a collection of codices. If I'm remembering correctly, there's 13 codices. A codex, the singular for codices, is an ancient form of a book. It's kind of the ancient book after the scroll. So anciently people used scrolls for a very, very long time. And after that, someone in the Roman period figured out that, hey, you know what, it's kind of more convenient if we take a bunch of little leaflets and bind them together on one side. Then we can have writing on both sides and flip back and forth easily without having to unroll this long sheet of papyrus or what have you. So these codices were buried sometime in the first half of the 4th century. So the 4th century is the 300s. So the first part of the 4th century. So this is, sometime about the time of Constantine, and it's at about the time when Christianity was coming into some sort of orthodoxy. In other words, prior to this point, Christianity had been very diverse. In fact, some historians don't even like to refer to it as Christianity, but rather as Christianities, which I think is more accurate. It's multiple different types of Christianities which are radically different one from another. And some of them would be actually called Christian. They would self-identify with that term, and others wouldn't. So these texts were buried most likely because Christianity was taking on a more set form, orthodoxy was being established, and all the heterodoxies, which means the others basically, hetero is others, so all these other systems of belief were basically being persecuted and diminished and brought to an end. And so evidently some people who were part of a persecuted minority decided, hey, we don't want our books burned, so better bury them. And it's a good thing because, hey, now we end up with it, and it's just more information concerning the ancient world. So in this library, there's many writings that are contained in the Nag Hammadi find. And one of the writings that was found within this collection is the text which we are investigating today, the Apocryphon of James, or the Secret Book of James. And first of all, I will say that this collection overall, most scholars view as a Gnostic library. Gnosticism is an ancient form of Christianity, and actually there's multiple forms of Gnosticism, but Gnosticism in general, kind of what made Gnosticism what it is the idea that suffering takes place in this world because this world is a bad place, that the physical universe is inherently evil. And the way that they explain that is they said that there is a kind of a realm of divine beings, which they defined to be non-physical, and there was different principles, masculine and feminine principles in this divine realm. Of course, they weren't physically or biologically masculine and feminine because the whole point is that it's non-physical. And one of these feminine beings, divine sort of beings, was named Sophia, or wisdom, and she decided that she was going to bring forth a child without the interaction of a male. And so she, ironically, did a foolish act and brought forth this being who ended up being pretty messed up. He wasn't brought forth as a regular divine being would be, and he's the guy who ended up creating the physical universe, and he's the guy who Christian Gnostics identified as the God of the Old Testament, as Yahweh. So to them, the Creator God, the God of the Old Testament, is actually a really messed up and even wicked God. And Jesus actually came to free us from that God's rule. He came to show us the secret knowledge which would enable us to escape our physical bodies. And the word Gnostic is from the Greek gnosis, which means knowledge. And so the idea is, well, it's being saved from the physical world by means of some sort of secret knowledge. And the knowledge has to do with how we all have, or at least some of us have, some sort of divine spark in us. And our divine spark is trapped in our bodies, our physical bodies, and we need to release it in some way. So that's all part of the knowledge, and then all the other aspects of the various Gnostic systems of belief. So that's kind of what makes Gnosticism what it is. And there are certainly Gnostic texts found within the Nag Hammadi library. So many people would say, okay, well, this is the Nag Hammadi library, and aren't all these texts then Gnostic? And of course, Orthodox Christians reject Gnosticism. Jewish Christians also reject Gnosticism, and I should specify the Nazarenes of ancient times. And any materialist will reject Gnosticism because it's inherently immaterialist. For example, Gnostics, because they believe that Jesus was a true being and a true teacher, they believe that he couldn't have been a physical being because physical automatically means evil. So they had a docetic view of Christ. Docetic means seems to appear. So he seemed to appear as human, but he really wasn't. So they don't really believe that Jesus was flesh. They don't believe that Jesus was human. They rejected the idea that he really suffered and died on the cross. Rather, they say that he appeared to. He just gave an appearance, but really he was laughing while it was happening. So that's all part of the Gnostic system of belief. It's very, very much so pro-immaterialism, promoting the belief in the existence of the non-physical. And so, of course, by definition, the system is false, as we have found that material reality is the only thing which can possibly define truth in any sensible way. And so that's one aspect. So someone, again, might wonder, well, why are we even looking at a text that's found in a Gnostic library? Well, first I'll say that we know for sure that not every text in the Nag Hammadi library is a Gnostic text. For all I know, it could have been the library of a Gnostic. The person who had this collection may have been Gnostic. That could be. I mean, there are Gnostic texts in the library. But how many people out there have a library that only contains writings which they accept and which agree in every particular with their belief system? Not many people. I know that I have plenty of books in my library which I do not agree with, but I have them, and they are of interest to me for the sake of research or whatever other purpose. So if the person who had the Nag Hammadi library and buried it in the 4th century was a Gnostic, it only requires that the individual considered these particular writings worth having. It doesn't mean that they are Gnostic. Gnostics, by the way, had their roots in a form of neo-platonism. In other words, they liked Plato, and they had their own rendition of Plato's ideas. Well, guess what? In the Nag Hammadi codices, there are some of the writings of Plato. Now, Plato was not a Gnostic. He couldn't be a Gnostic because he lived before Gnosticism came about. So this shows that, hey, there might be other texts which actually existed before Gnosticism came about, which a Gnostic might find interesting for some reason, or might find worth having for some reason, but which is not itself actually Gnostic. There are other texts in the Nag Hammadi library that are decidedly not Gnostic, though not always recognized by scholars to be not Gnostic. But one example is a writing known as Melchizedek. Now, this writing Melchizedek, in section 5, lines, or maybe this is maybe the way that this is notated is page 5 of the Codex, lines 1 to 17. It has some statements which are very much anti-Gnostic. So it's talking about beliefs which the author of this Melchizedek document considered to be false. So this, whoever wrote this is talking about what false people, false teachers said about Jesus. So notice what it says. They will say of him, he was not born, though he was. He does not eat, though he does eat. He does not drink, though he does drink. He is not circumcised, though he was circumcised. He is without real flesh, though he came in the flesh. He did not suffer death, though he did endure suffering. He did not rise from the dead, though he did rise from the dead. So you see here how the author of this text is specifically rejecting Gnostic ideas and putting them as in a thesis, antithesis format and saying, this is what they say, but the opposite is true. And this is what they say, but the opposite is true. They say this, but the opposite is true. And he goes on. So this person is denying that Jesus was not born, that he did not eat, that he did not drink, that he was not circumcised, that he was without real flesh, that he did not suffer death, and he did not rise from the dead. All those claims are things which the author of this Melchizedek document rejects. The author of this Melchizedek document actually affirms that he was born, that he eats, that he drinks, that he was circumcised, that he came in the flesh, that he endured suffering, and that he rose from the dead. Those are all specifically affirmed in this Melchizedek document. That is entirely not only not Gnostic, but anti-Gnostic. So that should make it quite clear to us that not everything in the Nag Hammadi library is a Gnostic text. So when we have these various writings, hey, these are all writings from the ancient world, most of which claim to teach some form of doctrine that is supposed to be the doctrine of Christ. So we have to investigate these documents. They're all relatively early and require our attention. Now, one of these texts, the Apocryphon of James, again, the text itself that we have is in Coptic. Coptic is an ancient Egyptian language written in Greek characters, in Greek letters. And pretty much all, if not all, of the Nag Hammadi library is a Coptic library. And so the Coptic text that was actually found is from the beginning of the 4th century. So we know that this text must predate that. Perhaps it's from the very end of the 2nd century, or from mid-2nd century, or from early 2nd century, or from the 3rd century. You know, you have different possibilities, and different scholars have different perspectives. This is something which is debated. And so I'm going to mention to you some things. You know, I have several writings which contain a translation of this work, or several books. And so I'm going to share with you some things from these books that I have. The first is a book called The Nag Hammadi Scriptures, the revised and updated translation of sacred Gnostic texts, edited by Marvin Meyer. Now, this text, by the way, this book really advocates the idea that all of these writings are Gnostic. Even the Melchizedek document, which is so overtly anti-Gnostic, the people who put together this book still think that it's Gnostic. And actually, they have a footnote in that section that I read to you in this Melchizedek document. And in this footnote, they say, here, the polemic is directed against those who advocate a docetic view of Jesus Christ. Such a polemic is surprising for a Gnostic text. Well, honestly, that's really just starting with a presupposition and trying to make this fit. This is absolutely anti-Gnostic. So the reason why it's surprising for a Gnostic text is because it's not a Gnostic text. If you want to judge it on its own merits, it absolutely rejects Gnosticism. So, but this is just to say that the people who put together this book have that particular bias where they're viewing this collection as primarily, if not entirely, Gnostic. So that is how they view it for the Apocryphon of James as well. They view it to be a Gnostic text. And I'll explain some of the reasons why they view it to be Gnostic, and we will see if they are good reasons. So the person who wrote the introduction to the Secret Book of James in this book is someone named Madeline Scapello. And Madeline says that it's Gnostic because in it Jesus tells James and Peter to be filled. And by the way, this whole text, basically what it is the story of the text is that it's a secret writing that James, the disciple, is writing to someone else who is asking for a written form of this revelation that was given to James and Peter. The idea is that 550 days after the resurrection of Jesus, Jesus appeared to the disciples and took Peter and James aside and had a dialogue with them in which he talked to them about various aspects of the way things are, of truth, and of their circumstances. And so this is James writing this down to give to this person who is asking for it. So in here, it's primarily dealing with James and Peter. And one of the things that Jesus says to James and Peter is for them to be filled. And in Gnostic teaching, there is an idea of the fullness and being filled. And so, okay, well, this must be Gnostic. There are some issues with that, though, because there are many places throughout the New Testament which, again, the New Testament, none of the documents in the New Testament are actually Gnostic documents. And any historian, any scholar will agree with that, because this is the New Testament of the Orthodox, quote-unquote, Orthodox Christian church. Well, the Orthodox was opposed to Gnosticism. So, anyway, there are many, many texts which talk about being filled in some way. Luke chapter 1, verse 15 talks about John the Baptist being filled with the Holy Spirit. Many other texts in Acts and also in Luke talk about being filled with the Holy Spirit and just being filled. Romans 15, verses 13 and 14 talk about this. It says, "Now may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you believe in him, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. But I myself am fully convinced about you, my brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge." Now this here, this must be really Gnostic. Guess what the word for knowledge is here? It's gnosis. So you're filled with gnosis. Does that mean that Paul was a Gnostic? Absolutely not. He does not teach any of the central teachings of Gnosticism, and he actually rejected those teachings. There were people, even in Paul's day, who had a trouble with the physical nature of the resurrection of Jesus, and Paul, in 1 Corinthians, especially chapter 15, so clearly argued in favor of the physical nature of the resurrection. So here, being filled with gnosis, filled with knowledge, and yet it's not a Gnostic text. And the other primary reason, or one of the other primary reasons for believing that the Apocryphon of James is Gnostic, is that it uses the word knowledge a couple times, gnosis. But again, that doesn't mean it's Gnostic just because there's the word gnosis. If you look up the word gnosis in the New Testament, it shows up 29 times. It's in Luke, in Romans, in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians, in Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Timothy, 1 Peter, 2 Peter. And those are the writings in the New Testament which use the word gnosis. It doesn't mean that they are Gnostic. Also, I'll just read another verse on this whole idea of fullness. This is Ephesians 3:19, or the idea of being filled. It says, "And thus to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God." Okay, so here's the thing. Christian Gnosticism had its origin after the writings of Paul. So it's not that Paul is saying something that is Gnostic. It's that Gnostics picked up on a few of the things that Paul talked about and other of the Nazarenes, and then they emphasized those points. So that later when people come along and read a text that has those things, people think, oh, well, that must be Gnostic. No, this is pre-Gnostic. Paul's writings are pre-Gnostic. And just because certain of these phrases occur in the Apocryphon of James doesn't mean that it's Gnostic, because it's not something that is unique to Gnosticism. Gnosticism picked it up, just like Gnosticism picked up things from Plato, and Gnosticism picked up things from Judaism, but Gnosticism is not Platonism, and is not Judaism, and is not Nazarene. It's not any of those things. It draws from them and combines them and pulls them into its unique system of belief. So in order to determine whether something is Gnostic, you have to find if it has the unique things of Gnosticism, not the shared things. This is just like if you have, let's see if I can remember the right name. It's a type of chart where you have circles, and you have the circles overlapping each other. And I know that the Allen girls will know the name of this because they were talking about it recently. But it's a type of chart. You have circles, they overlap each other, and where they overlap, you have certain points that are held in common.
Venn.
Venn.
Venn. Okay, Venn. That's right. A Venn chart.
A Venn diagram.
Venn diagram. Thank you, Carol. So in a Venn diagram, you can have two subjects represented by two circles. Let's just say you have chemistry and biology. And the two circles overlap. And where they overlap, you put the things that chemistry and biology have in common. And then within the sections where they don't overlap, you have the unique aspects of chemistry and biology, the non-overlapping aspects. So that's a very good way to illustrate this. So here's the thing. If you are trying to find out, is someone talking about chemistry or biology? And the only words that you hear are things that are shared between chemistry and biology, then you will not know whether they're talking about chemistry or biology. It could be one or the other because they are shared terms. So likewise here, we have terms like knowledge or gnosis and fullness or to be filled. And these things are used in Gnostic writings, these terms, but they are by no means unique to Gnosticism. So they are shared things. They belong where the circles overlap, and thus they cannot be used as evidence that it is Gnosticism or some other particular thing. It has to be judged on the unique points. So that's kind of how we have to approach this. Also, I'll mention in this writing, I'll read something. This is from page 21 of the Nag Hammadi scriptures. It says, this interpretation is strengthened by the fact that the secret book of James is a part of the Codex with Valentinian features. Some expressions referring to the Savior have a Gnostic flavor. For example, and now it's about to give a couple examples. The Savior says, I shall return to the place from which I came. And in a similar vein, I shall ascend to the place from which I have come. Okay, so the problem with that is that those statements are almost identical to statements found in the Gospel of John, which is decidedly not Gnostic because it teaches that the Word became flesh. The Gospel of John is so decidedly not Gnostic. It teaches the physical death and the physical resurrection of Jesus and so on. So it uses these phrases, which perhaps there's some types of Gnosticism that have similar phrases, but the problem is the Gospel of John has almost identical phrases. So those phrases cannot be used as evidence of the Gnostic nature of this text as is being done by the authors here. But they do point out, they say, for W.C. Van Eunek, however, the present tractate is not Gnostic, and its provenance should well be situated in a small Egyptian community sometime after the Jewish rebellion of 135 CE. The Christology of the treatise shows no docetic tendencies, which are common in Gnostic texts, and the passion and suffering of the Savior are understood as having been real. Okay, so I'll break that down a little bit. They're pointing out, well, there is this scholar who says that it's not Gnostic. By the way, he's by no means the only one. There's many scholars who say, no, this is definitely not Gnostic. And they point out that there's no docetism. In other words, there's no belief that Jesus was only an appearance of flesh. So docetism, again, is the belief that he was seen as an appearance, or he seemed to be an appearance, but that he actually wasn't flesh. That's docetism. Well, that's not here. There's no docetism, and it actually promotes the idea, or it understands the sufferings of Christ to be real, not some fiction. And in fact, it emphasizes their importance. So these are decidedly non-Gnostic. Also, they mention about this originating in Egypt, this text originating in Egypt. We'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, so those are some of the things from this particular book. Now, there's another book that I have here called The Apocryphal New Testament by J.K. Elliott. And in here, he has a translation of the Apocryphon of James, which he calls the Letter of James. And he points out some interesting things. He talks about another scholar, Koster, and he says Koster includes it among the formative Gospels of early Christianity. In other words, it's one of the Gospels that formed early Christianity. Because of claims such as his, that we have, so now he's explaining his claim, that we have in our hands a document comparable in age and influence to Papyrus Egerton II, to Q, and to the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. And also, because of its links with the canonical Gospels, it seemed appropriate to provide a translation of it here. Okay, so first he's pointing out that this scholar is saying that, look, the Apocryphon of James is comparable in age and in influence to a few other documents. The documents that it mentions, I will briefly explain what they are. There's one known as Papyrus Egerton II, which is one of the earliest Christian texts known, period. Many scholars believe it's earlier than the Gospels that we have in the New Testament, or at minimum, it's just as old. The documents, or the fragment of Papyrus Egerton II that is known, is one of the oldest fragments, period. It is from the very beginning of the 2nd century. So that's year 100 something, right at the very beginning of the 100s. And so it's very, very ancient, and it's an important text that is viewed by scholars and historians as being one of the earliest writings related to Jesus that had a large influence but has since been lost. And then another one is Q, so Papyrus Egerton II, and then Q is the next document. Q means source. It's German for source. And here's the idea of Q. Okay, so we have the 3 synoptic Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's very clear that Matthew, Mark, and Luke relate in some way to each other. They have so much overlapping material. The vast majority of scholars and historians, virtually all actually by now, have concluded that Matthew and Luke used Mark. That Mark came first, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark. Most scholars at the present time believe that Matthew did not use Luke and that Luke did not use Matthew. So they are independent from each other, but they both use Mark. This is the current consensus, or at least largely the consensus. There is challenge to that idea. So here's the thing. You can see places where Matthew and Luke have the same material, and it's found in Mark. So they're both using Mark, and so they have the same material because they're both using Mark. But you have other instances where Matthew and Luke have the same material, but it is not shared by Mark. It's not in the Gospel of Mark. So what most scholars have said is that, well, there must have been another document like Mark that both Matthew and Luke are using. And so that's a hypothetical source, which they call Q, source. And there may be something like that, but I'm not convinced that what scholars say about that is actually true. But either way, if there was a source that is Q, obviously it's a very ancient document, and even more ancient than Matthew and Luke. And then there's the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, which it's better to just call it the Gospel of Thomas because it's not originally written in Coptic. This Gospel of Thomas was found in the Nag Hammadi library. Before that, though, it was found at the beginning of the 20th century in the, let me not forget the name of this. Oh, that's right. The Oxyrhynchus, Oxyrhynchus dump, I guess. It's actually a huge garbage heap with many, 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 many ancient fragments of different texts, both Christian texts, Jewish texts, secular texts, Greek religious texts, and what have you. So the Gospel of Thomas is known to be a very important and early gospel, comparable in age to the Gospels in the New Testament, perhaps a little earlier, perhaps a little bit later, but right around the same time. The Gospel of Thomas is very important for a number of reasons. It is a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus, mostly without any sort of narrative, and it's, again, very early, and it doesn't seem to depend on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so it's is an independent witness to many sayings. About half of its sayings are contained in the New Testament, and the other half are sayings which we didn't know before, although some of them are shared with other things, even the Gospel according to the Hebrews, actually. So anyways, these are very early and important documents. Papyrus Egerton II, Q, and the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. So what is being pointed out in this book, The Apocryphal New Testament by J.K. Elliott, is that some scholars conclude that the Apocryphon of James is as old as these other writings. In other words, the Apocryphon of James, if that is correct, could be even older than Matthew and Luke and John and perhaps more. Who knows? But in other words, there are some scholars who believe that it is very early and has had a huge influence. So that's quite important. Also, in this book, they talk about how this text is often viewed as Gnostic, but it doesn't have any obviously Gnostic teachings. And, some scholars view it as Gnostic, some view it as having no connection to Gnosticism. And there's nothing, it lacks a heretical character, so to speak. It doesn't have anything which would be overtly seen to be heretical in it. So that's what this other writing had to say on the topic, or this other book. Also, I'm going to mention something from a journal, a scholarly journal, called the Journal of Biblical Literature. This is from volume 105, number 4. This is December 1986. And there's a review published in this issue of the Journal of Biblical Literature that is reviewing a book called Sayings Traditions in the Apocryphon of James by Ron Cameron. And the review is by another scholar, Charles W. Hedrick. And he reviews this book that is all about the sayings traditions in the Apocryphon of James. What they mean by that is there are a number of sayings that are attributed to Jesus within the Apocryphon of James, some of which are also found in the New Testament in a similar form, and some of which have no parallel in the New Testament. So this book is talking about this, and basically what this book argues for is the fact that the Apocryphon of James is very early, and that the sayings of Jesus that are in it do not depend upon the Gospels in the New Testament. Now, if they did depend, it would show that it came after them. But the fact is, it does not depend upon the Gospels in the New Testament. And basically, it goes through a lot of detail in relation to this, shows that the Apocryphon of James should be a primary source. And actually, I'll read the last paragraph of Charles Hedrick's review. This is what he says. Cameron's analysis validates the Apocryphon of James as an important primary source, both for studying the early Christian literary process leading from sayings to sayings collections to Gospels, and for identifying independent primary sources. And he says, it may light the way by which one rejected gospel, among others of its kind, too long judged the illegitimate children of early Christian literary activity, helps to legitimize the Church's favorite gospel, John, as a primary source for studying the earliest levels of the Jesus tradition. Okay, so what he's pointing out is that when you really study the Apocryphon of James, it has some parallels to John, which prove John to be an important primary text for understanding Jesus as well, because many people think that John isn't important for understanding Jesus. But this text can show that it really is, because it also is just as important and perhaps just as early or even earlier. So that's some other things that scholars have to say about this. And there's just one other book that I'm going to mention some things from before we get into the Apocryphon of James itself. And this other book is called New Testament Apocrypha. It's a 2-volume set, edited by Wilhelm Schneemelker. It was originally German, but then it was translated into English. And here he has an introduction to the Apocryphon of James and a translation of it. And this is some of what he says in his introduction. H.C.H. Puke assumed a date in the 2nd century for the Apocryphon of James, accepting Van Eunuch's further delimitation to the period between 125 and 150 and to Egypt. So in other words, this is kind of reviewing the scholarly discussions concerning the origin and the scholarship on the Apocryphon of James. So he's saying, okay, many have assumed that it's from the 2nd century, perhaps between the year 125 and 150. By the way, this is comparable to the date range to which many scholars attribute some of the writings within the New Testament. I know that for us, we often think that that's probably too late, and perhaps it is, but this is comparable in dating. So 2 Peter and a number of the letters of Paul and all of this, most scholars would date that to the same time that they are dating this text. So if those texts are earlier, like if they are authentic and if they are really written by Paul and Peter and so on, then they would be earlier, and the same would apply to this. So this opinion was generally accepted by scholars. An argument against a later date is the treatment of the sayings tradition in the Apocryphon of James, which does not yet reveal any dependence on canonized texts. So in other words, that's an argument against this being a later text. If this was a later text, it would most likely show some sort of dependence on the canonical text. And the reason why, of course, is because other texts were kind of swept under the rug to some degree. And so if you have something which is written at a later date and it talks about Jesus, well, where is it getting its information? If it's not in living memory of the people who knew Jesus, then it must be depending on some sort of sources. And since this isn't depending on the Gospels in the New Testament or the writings in the New Testament, then where is it getting its information? Well, if it came later, it would have had to get its information from other written texts, but it doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be an earlier text for that reason and for others. Next, since the Apocryphon of James uses the transmission formula, recall the words of the Lord, which was still fully valid to Papias, but which in the second half of the 2nd century could hardly claim authority any longer, the middle of the 2nd century should be regarded as the latest possible date for the composition of the Apocryphon of James. I'll break that down. There's a phrase that occurs in early Christian writings which says, recall the words of the Lord. And that's a phrase that would often occur just before quoting a saying of Jesus. There's a very early Christian writer from the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, known as Papias, and he used that phrase. So he's at kind of the latter stage of using that phrase. But once you get to the middle of the 2nd century, that phrase is no longer used because people aren't recalling the words of the Lord. They're quoting another text of what Jesus said. So here, because it uses the phrase, recall the words of the Lord, that pushes it to an earlier date. So the very latest possible date for this text is 150. That's like the very, very latest, the middle of the 2nd century. The terminus post quem cannot be precisely determined. Okay, the terminus post quem, what that means is the earliest possible date. So the earliest possible date cannot be precisely determined. The fact that the Apocryphon of James shares its subject matter with Matthew, John, and the first letter to the Corinthians should, however, allow the assumption that our writing might date from a period as early as the second half of the first century. Okay, second half of the first century, that's going from, the year 50 to the year 100. Well, that's the time of the apostles. That's when the apostles were actually still around. So if this text actually goes back that early, then, this actually goes to the time of the apostles themselves. Next, this says, to regard Egypt as its land of origin has become questionable because of the sayings traditions it contains, and because it shares its subject matter with other New Testament writings which suggest a common place of origin. In that case, a Syrian-Palestinian provenance is more plausible than Egypt, and this would also fit in better with James and Peter. In other words, it's more likely that this text actually had its origin in Palestine, which at the time was counted as part of Syria. So people talk about Syro-Palestinian geographical location and so on. Well, here this is the Syrian-Palestinian provenance. Provenance means place of origin. So here the scholar is pointing out, hey, this text may actually be as early as the middle of the first century, placing it before the Gospels of the New Testament, and in the land of Palestine, fitting with Peter and James. So that actually brings this text very, very, very early. So these are some of the reasons why this is important for us to examine. The dating of this text is supposed to be at about the same time, at least generally, as the writings contained in the New Testament. Maybe contemporary with the writings of Paul, maybe a little bit after, but if it's after, not by much, and maybe even before, maybe even as early as the middle of the first century, and in the land of Palestine. It does not show any sort of Gnostic tendencies or later theology. It does not show any dependence upon the writings in the New Testament. So it, again, has a lot going for it in terms of potential to be an early and authentic document. So this is something that we need to investigate. So we're actually going to read through the text together. I know that we've been on now for almost an hour. What do you guys think about taking a 10-minute break and coming back at 5 after the hour?
Sounds perfect.
Good idea.
That'd be fine.
Okay, excellent.
Okay.
All right, well, we'll be back and start again at 5 after the hour. Shalom.